Okay, welcome. A-level Buddhism Anthology Analysis of Karen Armstrong, section 23. Let's read it. The account of the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in the Pali text can leave the modern reader feeling baffled and frustrated. It's one of the places where these Theravada scriptures become opaque to people who are not expert yogins, since they dwell in such detail on meditative technologies or technicalities. More helpful to an outsider is the story told in the later scripture, the Nyaya Katha, which makes the notion of enlightenment more accessible to the ordinary mortals. As with its version of Gautama's going forth, this story explores the psychological and spiritual implications of the Enlightenment in a way that the lay person or Buddhist beginner can understand, because it has no yogic jargon, but gives us a wholly mythological account of the Enlightenment. The author is not attempting to write history in our sense, but draws instead on timeless imagery to show what is involved in the discovery of Nibbana. He uses motifs common in mythology, which has been aptly described as a pre-modern form of psychology, tracing the inner paths of the psyche and making clear the obscure world of the unconscious mind. Buddhism is an essentially psychological religion, so it's not surprising that the early Buddhist authors made such skillful use of mythology. Again, we must recall that none of these texts is concerned with telling us what actually happened, but rather is intended to help the audience gain their own enlightenment. So, what's going on in the text? Is Armstrong speaking biographically, reading herself into this, when she says the account of the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in these Pali texts can leave the modern reader feeling baffled and frustrated? Here, perhaps, she's speaking about her own struggle, her pluralist secular struggle to reframe Buddhism under her own paradigm of pluralistic, non-cognitive, heuristic interpretation, to repackage the Buddha and Buddhist enlightenment for the spiritual everyman. And who is speaking biographically? It is one of the places where these Theravada scriptures become opaque. Armstrong reference to the Pali canon, or probably is meant by the Theravada Scriptures. These Theravada Scriptures is not quite accurate. Theravada is a more modern term. While there are similarities, Mahayana scholars would challenge the idea that the Tipitaka is indeed Theravada scriptures. Here, perhaps she's speaking as much about her own struggle. Let's highlight this bit here. To people who are not expert yogins, since they dwell in such detail on meditative technicalities. She wants to embrace sympathetically Buddhism from her pluralistic perspective, but it's as much about her own struggle to reframe Buddhism. So if Armstrong's equating Theravada with the Nikaya period school that dominated, and is this appropriate? So people who are not, well, it seems Armstrong seems to equate Theravada meditation, Samantha plus Vipassana, with the pre-Buddhist Ramana movement ascetics, who were the expert yogins, this word expert, yogins, people who are not experts. She's quite as interested in not just Buddhist practitioners, but people who predated Buddhist practitioners. The Shramana movement that the Buddha apparently hung out with, these ascetics, 5 of whom would become his first followers. And they seek to minimize, and she seeks to minimize the beliefs that differentiate the two by just lumping them all together as expert yogins. Well, Theravada would say the early Buddhists were more expert than Shramana, that the Buddha was the expert, not the other Shramanics. They didn't get it. But she lumps it all together. It's all mysticism, and all mysticism is good. It is clear that from the stories, the Buddha did discover these 2 Buddhist yogins, and so this phrase, these expert yogins, is quite an important phrase here, and it'll speak to her wanting to privilege the story of Alama Kalarna and the other guy, Ramaputta Udeka, that he, it seemed in the stories at least, practiced with. Perhaps one was a Jain, and another was a Brahmin. Experts in meditation he practiced with. And so that's perhaps helpful, but it's disappointing and unsatisfying, at the least the way she lumps it together. It is Armstrong who's making the Theravada texts opaque, It is one of these places where these Theravada scriptures become opaque, this phrase here. Who's the one making it opaque, meaning it hard to read? It's her over-mystification, her dumbing down is what makes things opaque as much as the actual texts themselves, by way of her alternative dharma, the truth of Karen Armstrong, not actually the ancient truth of any original texts. So let's read on here. Is Armstrong's apparent reliance on helpful hagiographic text appropriate to her claims to knowledge? A helpful text to outsider is the story told in the later scripture, the Nyaya Katha. So the Nyaya Katha. So Armstrong's Nyaya Katha. It's meaning the story of the lineage is a questionable source. This could be called a scripture, but it's just a 5th century CE or AD later commentorial introduction to earlier Pali Canon Jataka stories and other folk stories of the Buddha's previous lives. And it's a hagiography. It's not a really good text to quote. A great many folklore tales had developed, 550, and were attributed to the lives of the Buddha in the Buddhist commentaries. And there was an attempt to try and increasingly harmonize these more recent recensions, developments, inventions with the Buddhist canonical scriptures. And the Jataka Katha attempts to frame these folk stories along orthodox Theravada ideas, perhaps in response to Mahayana Jataka versions. So lists of the previous lives of the Buddha evolved over the centuries after the Buddha. The typical lists of previous lives of the Buddha you find in the Pali Canon are found in this text, in the 2nd century Jataka and in the 5th century Jataka Kathya. This is another text. However, it's sometimes something that simplifies not always helpful. She is accepting this 1,000-year-old after the fact text. 5th century BC is the Buddha, 5th century AD is the Nyaya Katha, as accepting it as authoritative and is even more troublesome, and accepting it as historical is just too much. She does not help the reader understand the text. It's an introduction to a variety of folk stories. She just lumps it all together, flattens it, homogenizes it, and it's difficult to agree that this is the case because she, as she admits, it's a wholly mythological. She says it here. Let's highlight it. A wholly Where do we see it? A wholly mythological account of the Buddha. That's right at the end here. She talks about mythology a lot. Skillful use of mythology. A wholly mythological account of the Enlightenment. So is it helpful? Nah, not particularly. Why is Armstrong so interested in giving us a mythical account that makes the notion of the Enlightenment more accessible to mortals, giving a wholly mythological account of the Enlightenment? She perhaps realizes that the therapeutic modern man, read someone like any modern accounts, is in a crisis of meaning. There's a crisis of meaning. Empiricism from Kant and Hume et al. Have left us without, as Peter Berger would count, a sacred canopy. And increasingly we are becoming the therapeutic self, this idea that Philip Rieff, the psychologist, develops. And Peter Berger, the sociologist, says we've got no overriding story. We're just a buffered self, to talk about the secular age, Charles Taylor's. We're just buffered selves. There's no transcendent. So making the notion of enlightenment more accessible to who? Well, are we talking about atheists and people who don't believe in the transcendent? How can you make something supernatural accessible to people who don't believe in the supernatural? Well, you have to make the people who don't believe in the supernatural believe in some sort of thin type of spirituality, I suppose. Western culture has no story to tell us that imbues us with transcendent meaning. Jung and his followers today, Jordan Peterson, and et al. And Armstrong's quite Jungian, and I think in her use, she's not an atheist, and she's quite Jungian, and she thinks therefore in Jungian terms. And she's suggesting a non-empirical mystical hope in what might be described as the God beyond God in Tillich's term, or some mystical idea of non-theism. I think John Vervaeke or someone like that. So is it more accessible? Well, to ordinary mortals, to people who aren't too interested in as personal deity, Western post-Enlightenment secular people, well, probably her version is, at least that's what she's trying to do. So what does Armstrong mean by timeless imagery and motifs? The author's not attempting to write a history in our sense, but draws instead on timeless imagery to show what is involved in the discovering of Nibbana, and he uses motifs. She here is perhaps now pressing the accelerator down on her use of the great depth psychologists of Jung and for him Freud, the psychoanalysts, and their beliefs that to find meaning variously you had to have some shared structure of symbols, archetypes, as Jung will talk about, that reflect perhaps her internalized schemas and schematas, and a sort of immanent social imaginary. This is Charles Taylor's idea. There's nothing, we can't have an enchanted world. We can't have a transcendent sacred canopy above us, but everything has to be flattened, has to be reduced down to this mere historical plane, this immanent way of thinking, not belief, but this immanent way of imagining the world, this frame of reference. And she wants a Buddha that is a buffered self, who's not really interested in re-enchanting the world. Or so maybe the theory of archetypes by the psychoanalytical psychologist Carl Jung is really, really in view here. So this is a Jungian Buddhist. Her mysticism perhaps is being closer to the nature religion of panentheism than non-theism of Buddhism. Panentheism is the kind of belief of Spinoza and people like that God is is the universe. They're one and the same, and God is, in Jungian terms, is an archetype, is a project. Well, it's not just a projection. That would be wrong. But God is what bubbles up from the subconscious, from the collective unconscious in Jungian terms. So the panentheism really was influential in the mid-20th century and probably has influenced Armstrong's move away from her Catholic non-conservatism to her, whatever she is now, spirituality, her eclectic, her eclectic use of, this comes up later when she talks of ecstasis, or when she's talked already of it, in the moment of truth and revelation. Remember, the Buddhist stood outside himself in the rose apple tree, a moment of ecstasis. She's interested in mysticism and ecstasis. So Freud and Jung, who are so interested in the conscious and the unconscious mind, Jung in the collective unconscious, who have these mystified mechanisms of the collective unconscious or the unconscious mind that somehow are embedded mystically, unpredictably in the far past. So is Armstrong a mid-20th century mythicist? That's a really interesting question. She says he used motifs in common with mythology, which has been aptly described as a pre-modern form of psychology, tracing inner paths of the psyche and making clear the obscure world of the unconscious mind. So mythology, very important to Jungian terms. Think the story of the hero's journey and the images, symbols, and mythology involved in the hero's journey. Is she a mythicist? Does it matter to her if the Buddha even existed? Probably not. But it's a deeply problematic viewpoint, as this would be disputed by Buddhists and by psychologists. Buddhists would say the Buddha is not merely a myth. Not merely a myth. He's real, he's historical. He lived, and then Theravada said he went to the Parinibbana, he died. And psychologists, Buddhism is psychological, but it's not modern psychology. The 30 levels of consciousness, might have sounded great in the before modern things developed, but the 30 levels of consciousness are not modern psychology. These are parts of the Abhidharma text, and this is by no means aiming at what Freud and Jung would talk about, finding a kind of equilibrium, a harmony, a particular psychological view and end today, such as just sort of being functionally, just functioning, typically therapeutic, and like psychology's aimed at. There's no end to it, but just to get as functioning as you can. But it's deeply problematic, her Jungian psychological account. It's not true to Jungianism, and it's not really true to Buddhism. So we read on. The mythicism that she's referring to, the mythicism, we read on, Buddhism is essentially a psychological religion. Well, but it's not Jungian, it's not modern psychology. So it's surprising that the early Buddhist authors make such skillful use of mythology. Here's this word here, mythology. Mythology, let's highlight it in purple there, yeah? Mythology. Mythicism is a really important idea that has its origin in a guy called Lessay, Lessay's ditch, the ditch between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. You can't, a ditch that assumes an anti-supernatural, empirical, agnostic perspective is the line in the sand that you cannot cross. You can either have a historical person of Jesus, or you can have a Jesus of faith who mythically talks about miracles but doesn't actually do them, or a historical Jesus who, well, there's something going on, but certainly there's no miracles going along. But mythicism is, as it is in 20th century's biblical studies, is a hermeneutic, a development you see in Bultmann, who wants to demythologize the Gospels. Well, she's doing the same thing. Armstrong is demythologizing the Buddha. And it's her belief that religious figures like Buddha or Jesus Christ even ever existed as historical figures, but were derived from prior myths. Jung and others are mythicists, and that Jesus came from a group of mythical gods and demigods from Greek and Roman times. And this is just out of date. It's over 100 years out of date. The context for Jesus is the Jewish context. New Testament studies has come on a long way and recognize the old 18th, 19th century theory, dying and rising gods of Osiris and all of that sort of stuff is so out of date. And no contemporary New Testament scholar would talk about it. And her, as a nun, she would know about this biblical study stuff. And she's trying to transfer her historical critical mythicism approach to the Buddha, to say, hang on, the Buddha probably didn't exist, and what we know about him is the influence of prior mythologies. Now, that might be justified. It could well be that much of the Buddha's life is an amalgam, a series of recensions. Certainly the hagiographies are. But the myth of the Buddhas, or maybe just his enlightenment, comes from prior yogi's experience. Or is it Armstrong? Is she trying to read into the text what she wants to find? A generalized, mystical, religious figure who represents all of us in our modern, spiritual, but not too moral, anti-religious, secular, pluralist viewpoint. So mythicism is the belief so mythicism is probably a key part of her scholarly perspective. But she doesn't cite sources. She doesn't tell us her perspective on big history, mythicism, or anything else. Nor does she defend the view from criticisms that its heyday was the 1950s. Parallelomania was what it was criticized as. You kept seeing causal links between disparate religious beliefs. what somebody believed in China affected what somebody believed in South America, which affected somebody that believed in Israel. And these things are unconnected, but people found links, so therefore there must be links. Well, that's just spurious and tenacious and unjustified. And she doesn't justify or her interest in this. So despite populist interest online, it's just not an approach used widely in the academic world today. Now, one of the key mythicists is Richard Carrier, who's a New Testament critic. Have a look at him. Very interesting, the stuff he comes up with. It's very creative. It's just a shame pretty much most of it's rejected. Read the atheist scholar Bart Ehrman, who rejects Carrier. So is Armstrong being skillful? She just says at the end here, we'll just finish with this. Early Buddhist authors made use, so it's not surprising that early Buddhist authors made such skillful use of mythology. And is she being skillful? Is she doing upaya? The word here, skillful, is unclear. Whether it's the Theravada idea of just being skillful, kusala, a skillful approach to meditation, having in mind something that's clear, a piercing truth, skillful truth into the reality of anicca, dukkha, and anatta through religious experience, leaving off the fetters and moving through the jhanas. She just doesn't say. Or is it upaya? Upaya. The Mahayana person will talk about upaya, this idea. Upaya, kusala, skillful means the capacity to, in the Lotus Sutra, lie to people like the children in the burning house as a pragmatic way to help others. Which form of skillful is she referring to? Well, she's flattening it all. A skillful use of mythology. It seems she means more of the latter, despite it being a Theravada text. So this was section 23.